talking about miracles in general and the miracle of Hanukkah in particular. Today, I'd like to give a kind of historical sketch of some of the outstanding miracles that we had in the development of the Jewish people. I think there's the theme that I mentioned yesterday is pretty clearly articulated, and it's articulated as a progression, moving, I would say, from the outside in terms of how we understand what we think of as nature, we call nature, and how we should understand it. And I want to try to place the events in their own historical context by imagining an observer, an outside observer. If he saw these events, what would he think of them? What would it cause him to think about his understanding of the world? Now let's start with the plagues in Egypt. There were 10 plagues, and you could divide them into two categories. Some were absolute contradictions of nature. Things happen, they don't happen in nature at all, period. And some were enhancements of otherwise natural processes, but done in such a way that it was unmistakable that it was divine agency, but it wasn't something that simply contradicts nature. It makes use of natural processes in a miraculous way. So let's take a look at the two groups, take a look at some of the examples and see what this means. Let's take, for example, the water turning to blood, the first plague. Well, water doesn't turn to blood, it just doesn't. Not little bits, and not sometimes, and not in the full moon, and not in the 13th year of the 13th Jubilee cycle. It just doesn't happen. When that happened, it was simply something which didn't happen before, didn't happen since, and it was something of which people had no experience whatsoever. Or the hailstones, which were accompanied by fire. Fire in the hail. We don't have any record of such a thing, and we don't have any natural explanation of such a thing. Though I did see, maybe 5 years ago, a report of some deep sea dredging where they picked up frozen methane from the seabed, and when it was brought to normal atmospheric pressure, not being underwater, it burst into flame, and they were holding in their hands frozen crystals with flame coming out. But that's from the seabed 2 miles down. That's not something that falls out of the sky. And then you had continuous darkness for days, total darkness, even without the oral tradition that says that they were immobilized, but just total darkness for several days is something that doesn't happen. And there are no medical conditions that are known to strike firstborn children. There's no particular medical susceptibility of firstborn children over other children. So those 4 plagues were just absolute contradictions to the natural order. Now, on the other hand, the other 6 plagues, the Torah goes out of its way to describe them in specifically naturalistic terms. Let's take the frogs. Where did the frogs that inundated Egypt come from? They came from the river. It says so in the verse, they came from the river. That's where frogs always come from. They didn't fall from the heavens or grow out of the flower pots. They came from the river where they always come from. Of course, it was predicted, and it was an infestation unlike any infestation in the past. And when Pharaoh decided what time they would like them to leave, and Moses said they would leave, they all left at once. So the timing and the severity and the disappearance are all non-natural, but those are features of an otherwise natural process, the Nile producing frogs. Then you have lice, body lice. Is a problem all over the world until maybe 30 years ago, it was a common problem here. Not everybody has lice all the time. Not everyone is fully infested. So to say that the whole population is suddenly all going to have lice, it's a natural process, greatly enhanced and predicted, which then becomes miraculous. You have the wild animals, which typically avoid human habitation, and here they lost their fear and they terrorized the population. Well, animals are afraid of people, especially people who kindle fire. In this case, they had no fear whatsoever. But their animals wasn't mythical animals like Tyrannosaurus Rex. No, did I say that? I'm fighting the problem of evolution now and paleontology. And other sorts of mythical animals. No, it's the same animals that live in the hills, only now they came into human habitation. The locusts, the Torah says specifically that the locusts were blown in on the wind. That's how locusts travel. Yeah, they have wings. They can fly a block or two, but they're going to travel miles and miles. They ride on the wind. That's how they travel. So instead of them suddenly appearing out of nowhere, no, they came in on the wind the way locusts always come. It's just that you don't have the wind blowing in one direction for 12 hours. That's not normal, or 24 hours. So you have a semi-natural process where the guts of the process are natural, but the way it expresses itself is supernatural. Now, I think if you were an Egyptian polytheist, Egyptian who, and by the way, in those years, those periods, if you were, let's say, an Egyptian, you believed in the Egyptian gods, you didn't have any complaint against the Babylonian gods. And in fact, if you would go to Babylonia, you would offer sacrifice to the Babylonian gods because, it's their area, and it might pay to give them some recognition, and vice versa. This idea that if my ideas are right, everybody else's ideas have to be wrong, is a Jewish idea, where we say we have a picture of the universe and it's right, and everybody else's ideas are wrong. That's was not an ancient idea. At any rate, if you have an Egyptian and a polytheist, and he sees the water turn to blood, certainly unexpected. The Nile was one of their gods. To see that the Jewish God can turn the water to blood is pretty impressive. Their attitude towards the Jewish people up until that time was something like, I don't know if they have gods or they don't, but if they do, they're pretty paltry. I mean, we've been enslaving them for 90 years and they didn't do anything. So obviously they're minor and they're weak, and they certainly can't stand up to the mighty Egyptian gods. All of a sudden, the substance of the Nile god turns to blood when the Jewish representative says it's going to, and does it in front of their eyes. And then the whole thing turns to blood. Well, that's pretty surprising. What conclusion should an Egyptian draw about that? Well, let's see what happens afterwards. What happens afterwards is the Nile recovers its normal constitution of water, and things go along for a few weeks, and nothing much happens. Well, we do have to change our idea about the Jews. They definitely have some kind of power behind them. But look, it only happens once. He never attacks the Nile again, does he? No. I'll bet he just snuck up behind the Nile when he wasn't looking and gave him a hit. Because afterwards, when the Nile's on his guard, he doesn't dare to touch him anymore, does he? Goes on to other things. So, okay, there's something there. And by the way, 3 weeks between the plagues, I guess it's tiring to pull off a plague like that, and he has to rest. This was their mental set of interpreting these events. The gods are human in form and human in temperament, and although they have much more power than human beings do, they have limited power. Notice that they fight among each other, and sometimes this one wins, sometimes that one wins. So, yeah, you have to realize that the Jews have something behind them, but who knows how seriously they take it. And the same thing's true with the other ones that take the hail. Okay, once upon a time, hail came down with fire in it, and that's something which we don't know how to explain. So it means that in addition to all the forces of nature, which are true and real and operate and powerful, there's another force. And this force, from time to time, temporarily for a short period, can cause disruption in the otherwise normal natural powers, and then quit and take a rest and go on to something else. So you definitely have to take it into account. You can't just ignore it. But would I give up my belief system, my philosophy, my understanding of the world because of these plagues? Why would I do that? I would just add the Jewish God to the list. Okay, surprise, surprise. There's another one. And from time to time, he does things that we didn't expect. After all, an Egyptian could say, the Nile overflows and feeds the whole country and provides us with an economy of selling food to the rest of the world every year for hundreds of years. And your God pulled off something for a week. Okay, nice, we could send a postcard about it. Can't compare it to the Nile. Can't compare it to the sun, which shines every day, it's shining for as long as history goes on. And your God does something for a week and then takes a rest. Okay, well, certainly wouldn't have to change his whole philosophy. That's stage one, that there's something more than just natural powers. But the other 6 plagues have a little bit more of an implication. Let's take the frogs. According to the polytheistic outlook, the natural functions, what we call natural functions, are under the control of various divine powers. There's a god of the sun, and a god of the moon, and a god of the sea, and a god of the winds, and a god of death, and a god of victory and war, and a god of love. And each of these natural features is under the control of some supernatural power, which manifests it. The frog production of the Nile is under the control of one of these powers, just like everything else is under control of these powers. So, and the Nile produces frogs on a regular basis. But then there's this Jew, Moses, and he somehow engineers that the Nile frog production should go nuts. 100 times as much as otherwise would be. And it starts when he says so, and it ends when he says so. So what's the Jewish God doing now? The Jewish God is manipulating the Nile's frog production. But in a picture of the polytheist, that's under, some one of their many powers in the pantheon. Call it Q. And Q is the one who's been doing it from time immemorial and does it all the time. Frog production under Q. Now, what happened now? Sounds like the Jewish God invaded Q's domain, took over Q's domain. Either took over Q altogether or took over Q's domain. So, the normal picture in polytheism isn't that there are 2 powers in one realm. There aren't 2 gods of the sun, one for Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday, and one for Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, and on Shabbos they take a rest. No, there's one sun and one God, one moon and one God, one sea and one God. Not separate gods for the same thing. So a thoughtful polytheist would have to say, so what am I going to say about the frogs? That week, for sure, it wasn't Q. That week it was Moses' God. Who's doing it the rest of the time? Could it be that the rest of the time it's also the Jewish God? Could it be that our picture of having many different powers for many different phenomena is not a good picture? And so it goes with the lice, and so it goes with the wild animals, and so it goes with the locusts, the wind blowing. Each one of these areas, the Jewish God invades a natural phenomenon which up until then was under the control of another one of the pantheon, another one of the powers that they represent. And one by one, the Jewish God is appearing here and here and here and here. That could lead a thoughtful Egyptian to reconsider the whole structure of his outlook, the whole picture of the world. And I want to share with you an idea which occurred to me many years ago, and I've said it many times, and recently I found it in the Maharal. I was very, very happy to find it there. Because when I think it up, maybe it's true and maybe it's not. If the Baral says it, then it's got to be taken very seriously. If you look at the world without our modern understanding of it and think, how should you understand it and how should you explain it? I think monotheism is a very poor choice. It's a very poor choice. Because the world has in it things that happen which seem to have no connection with one another, no common element. The sun rises every day and sets every day, and it has a yearly cycle moving north and south in the heavens. And it's the same cycle and the same effects always. The wind blows this way, it blows that way, and it's unpredictable and it's various. Why would you think that the power that's behind the behavior of the sun is the same power that's behind the behavior of the wind? What do they have in common which would lead you to associate them with one another? And then there's the sea. The sea has tides, and roughly every 12 hours they go in and they go out. Right? It's regular, substantial change. That's not like the sun. It's not like the wind either. And then you have grass. Grass grows in the spring and flourishes throughout the summer and gets weaker in the fall and disappears in the winter. And it's a yearly cycle. And it's alive. And none of the things we described before are alive. Why would you think that the power behind the sun is the power behind the grass? Isn't it natural and obvious that the world is under the control of various different powers which express different types of behavior in the world? Why would you start with an assumption that is all the manifestation of one power? And I haven't really studied history in great detail, but I have read that the idea of a single power behind the world was promoted by monotheistic believers, by Christian scientists. I don't mean the Christian Science movement. I mean scientists who happen to be Christian, because if there's one creator, well, if there's one creator, that's a reason to think that everything goes back to one agency. We'll have to understand that agency is very complex, but it's one, not many. But without that, why would you think that? Here, I'm picturing the natural outlook of an Egyptian, and he's experiencing these events, and the 6 plagues, which harness natural phenomena in an unnatural way, could cause a thoughtful Egyptian to rethink his whole position and think, maybe it isn't really divided up among different powers, but there's one power behind all of it. That's, I think, the first hint of the miracle encroaching on the area of the natural, the miracle stimulating a thought that maybe I have to rethink the nature of nature. Is this thought, are we together with this thought? Okay, now I think that Purim takes this thought process further and moves it to another dimension, but still in the same direction. Let's rehearse the events of the Megillas Esther, and again, from the point of view of an observer, how the observer would interpret what's going on. Well, Achashverosh has a party, a bash, 6 months long. He knew how to party. Even Los Angeles could take some lessons from that. And the whole empire was involved, and everybody was satisfied, and so on. And after that, he had a week for the people in the capital, who are parts of his government, a special celebration for them. And at the end of the 7 days, when his heart was merry with wine, he decided to invite the queen to make an appearance. And this was politically something which was a background of struggle and strain between the two of them, because she was the granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar, and he had no royal blood in his veins. He was someone, perhaps a general in the army, who took over. And he wanted to embarrass her publicly. She said no. She refused and stood on her own authority and honor. And he had his advisors advise him how to win the struggle with her. And one of them, who was very clever, made it into a feminist issue, or rather an anti-feminist issue. And the advice was taken, and she was deposed as queen. Okay, so now the observer is looking. This observer could be a Persian, or it could be a Jew also. What would he think? These people are crude, and they're base, and they're uncivilized, and power is very important, and there was a struggle, and he won and she lost. So what? It happens. Okay, now a new queen has to be chosen, and the king, in normal, ancient Eastern royalty procedure, has a talent search and one girl a night, and it goes on for 4 years. And then Esther is chosen. Wow, Esther's chosen. What's the probability of that? 4 years is over 1,000 girls, right? And who knows any more are out there and waiting, so on and so on. It's 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000. Yeah, but of course, anyone who is chosen would be 1 in 10,000, wouldn't she? A lottery is a mechanism whereby you guarantee something very unlikely will happen. And then, when something unlikely happens, you don't say, gee, it's so unlikely it must be a miracle. It's not a miracle. It was produced by a lottery. That's what lotteries do. Lotteries guarantee that unlikely things will happen. So now you know why it happened. Why would you think that because she was chosen out of all of them, whichever one was chosen out of all of them? So from the point of view of just it's being very unlikely, the unlikeliness doesn't contribute to the idea of a miracle at all. As a Jew, you might say, look, we believe that other things are behind it. Yeah, but that's because you already believe it. But if you're not committed to that to start with, we regard it as just one of those things that happens. Okay, so now there's a plot on the life of the king, Ahasuerus, and the two plotters, because they're from a foreign land and speak a language nobody knows, are discussing this in public, using their foreign language. And Mordechai happens to know that language, and he overhears it, and reveals the plot to the queen, who then tells the plot to the king in Mordechai's name, and it is investigated, discovered, and the plotters are killed. Well, plots against the life of people, especially people in authority, are very common. I would say they happen more often than not. You can bet there are at least 50 different plots going on right now to kill Netanyahu. Iran behind 45 of them, and the other 5 by other people who don't like him. And almost always the plots are foiled because otherwise it would hardly pay to be in authority because you wouldn't be there long. So it's not so surprising that there was a plot, and not so surprising that it was uncovered and discovered. Okay, now the king writes it down in his book of memos. Pay attention to the vocabulary there. Malbin points this out. It's not a Sefer Zichronos, Sefer Divrei Hayamim, which would be a history book. Sefer Zichronos, it's a book of memos. Memos of things to do. And he forgets about it. Is that a miracle that he forgot something he wrote down to do? I mean, that happens to everybody, right? It certainly happens to kings. That's why they have other people around to remind them. This got forgotten. All of these events would have no hint of being understood as miraculous or expressions of divine providence at all. Now, Haman conceives a hatred for Mordechai, for the Jewish people. It's a long story, and he plots to destroy all of them. But as far as Mordechai is concerned, he can't wait. And his advisors and his wife, in that order, tell him, his wife and his advisors, in that order, tell him, go to the king. You're the prime minister, and you're favored by the king. Go to the king and tell him to kill Mordechai. He'll listen to you and he'll do what you want. So here he is. Haman's on his way to the palace. Tell the king to kill Mordechai. That night, the king can't sleep. Well, why can't he sleep? He doesn't know. He thinks, maybe there was something that I didn't do. Maybe something's bothering me that I should have done and didn't do. And here, by the way, when I have taught the Megillah in the past, I made a joke out of it, but it was a mistake. This is his Sefer Zichronos. It's not a history book. Then I used to say, if you want to fall asleep, read history. It'll put you to sleep. But that's not it. No, this is a book of memos. Chazal says it's a book of memos. Maybe I thought to do something, I planned to do something, and I didn't carry it out. Let's check. Okay, this is 4 years. The thing with the plot's 4 years before. Okay. So he said, okay, bring the book of memos and read. And it just, of course, it's a scroll, and it just happens to open to that incident 4 years ago when Mordechai saved the king's life, and it's in the book of memos. And the king says, wow, he saved my life. Did we reward him in any way? That's why it's in the book of memos. The book of memos, because he saved my life, so I should do something about it. Did we reward him? And they said, no, sorry. No record here of his being rewarded. Oh. Who's in the courtyard? Oh, your kingship. Haman's in the courtyard. Send him in. In he comes to tell to Achashverosh to kill Mordechai. And the king, for reasons which are there in the book also, the king says to him, here's what I want you to do. I want you to honor Mordechai. Honor him in the greatest way possible because he saved my life. And I think at this point, the reader becomes a little suspicious. This really sounds contrived. This doesn't sound like normal events, normal history. If you try to submit this as a novel to a publisher, the publisher would say, I'm sorry. This is just not believable. It's not, no one's going to take this seriously as a reasonable story. That's the whole point. Yes, it's not reasonable as just a story because things like that don't happen because it's contrived. Yes, contrived with a capital C. There's a contriver here making it happen. That's the point of the story. At this point, the observer has to say, hey, this is too much of a coincidence. And guess what? The queen is also Jewish. And she's there to plead with the king to reverse Haman's strategy. At this point, the observer says, aha, it was all a plot. The whole thing was a plot. Look at that. Kosh Baruch Hu arranged it that this plot shouldn't come to fruition because of what happened. So now, when the person makes this realization, he then has to think, let's go back at what happened over the last 10 years and see how did I react and was my reaction reasonable? There was this party, and this party, he threw out the queen. Was that just an accident? Was that just, Near Eastern, semi-Oriental nonsense? No, because the party which led to the removal of Vashti made room for Esther. And then Esther's winning the lottery wasn't just a 1 in 1,000 chance where anyone who would have won it. No, she was put in that position specifically to be there years later to counteract. And then when Mordechai overhears the plotters talking, and he knows the language and they don't, yes, there are lots of plots. Yes, lots of plots are discovered. But look what happened with this one. With this one, he got written down in the book of Zichronos. And then 4 years later, that book is open to just that part of the scroll. So that just that moment, he has to remember Mordechai and contradict Haman's coming in to kill him. Now the whole thing looks contrived from the beginning. All the way through it looks contrived. And it is contrived. And by the way, the idea that the king didn't reward Mordechai, although you could have an explanation for that. After all, if somebody saves your life, wouldn't you want to reward him to encourage other people to save your life? Wouldn't that be a good investment, right? But he's a Jew, and the Jews have no independence. He has 127 provinces. Each province is a nation, an ethnic group, a culture with its own leaders, and he's the emperor over all of them. Jews don't have that. Jews are just scattered minorities. That's why Haman, when he sees Mordechai insulting him in public, and he wants to kill him, he says, "Vayivez be'einav l'shloach yad b'Mordechai haYehudi." It would be a disgrace for him to take revenge against Mordechai, Because people would say, you noticed a Jew? A Jew bothered you? Jews are nothing. How could it possibly bother you that a Jew, it's like being enraged by a crow croaking in the wind, which disturbs your sleep. Would you take a gun and shoot the crow? I mean, what's the matter with you? So that could be the reason why Achashverosh didn't reward him either. He's only a Jew. And then he comes to think better of it later, because he can't sleep, so something's bothering him. At any rate, now you have to say the fact that he couldn't sleep also is a miracle. The fact that he forgot it, wrote it in Zichronos and forgot it, and the fact that he couldn't fall asleep, and the fact that the scroll was open to specifically that, all of that was arranged by divine providence. So the message here is, things that when they happened, I took them as natural, and that meaning unguided, unmanaged, uncontrolled, no providence behind them, that's a mistake. At least in these cases, these things which I interpreted as natural turn out to be not natural, or nature has to be understood in a different way. That's the same impulse. The miracle casts light on the non-miraculous. The miracle causes you to re-understand the non-miraculous. That's the third stage. And then I think that Hanukkah is the fourth stage. As I said yesterday, the idea of the war, as the Maharal points out, nowhere in any of our prayers is the miracle of the oil mentioned. It's not even mentioned, which is very shocking. And even when we light the menorah, the miracle of the lights isn't mentioned. Only the war is mentioned, and he says the purpose of it is to see in the miracle of the oil a pointer to the fact that the war, which you might have thought was simply natural, also was divine providence. That's the final stage of this procedure. So that's the basic idea of seeing what looks like nature as really a divine production. Are we together? Okay, so now some of the commentators point out that this miracle took place, the Purim miracle took place in exile, took place in Persia. There's a case where some people thought, and this is not totally mistaken, miracles and prophecy belong in the Holy Land of Israel. But they won't happen outside the land of Israel. And for prophecy, that's pretty clearly correct. Because I'll talk about that. So, okay, they don't, and therefore what? Well, maybe God's control and providence only works in the land of Israel. Hashem's eyes are in the land from the beginning of the year to the end of year, without the. And in the land, so maybe not elsewhere. So then they're in danger of losing connection with the idea of divine providence. So this miracle takes place. In a certain sense, the Hanukkah miracle is worse because there, the outside exile culture invades the land of Israel. It takes place in the land of Israel, but at a time when the Greeks are controlling the land of Israel. I don't know if you appreciate, the war of the Maccabees was not only against the Greeks, it was against the Jews who identified with the Greeks. It was also a civil war. There was a Greek culture here. There were Greek schools here. We have writings of our sources in Greek. There's a Haggadah, fragments of a Haggadah in Greek. It was a case, they talk about how you're going to take the Jew out of exile, how you're going to take exile out of the Jew. And that's a good twist. And here, the exile invaded the land of Israel. So in a certain sense, it's more tragic. It's more crucial. And the miracle then, again, communicates the idea that what we classify as natural is something which is really divine providence. That's the fundamental message that I wanted to communicate to you about the Purim, the Hanukkah miracle. Now, we have to sort of take this idea that what we call nature is really divine providence and sort of put it into the mosaic of our understanding of the world in an appropriate way, so we don't end up with mistaken conclusions. Let's see. So everything that happens, aside from people's decisions, everything that happens is caused by God's will. It's caused by God's will. So then, how do we look at an action? A person does an action, gives charity. Someone asks for money, puts his hand in his pocket, pulls out the money, drops it in the hand. Well, the person's asking for charity, so I have to decide. Do I want to give the charity or do I not? And I make a decision. But when the hand goes into the pocket and the fingers grip the coin and then deliver it to the hand of the other person, all of that is a physical behavior. And that physical behavior is part of the physical world which God is producing. Every action is a partnership. The person makes the decision and God manipulates the body to carry out the decision. So, who's really doing it? Well, it's a split. I'm making the decision, and God is causing the body to carry it out. Should I get credit for the poor person now having money? I mean, it was my hand that delivered the coin, but I'm not in charge of my hand. I'm not making my hand move. God is making my hand move. And what about crimes? So, Reuven pulls the trigger, and the bullet strikes Shimon, and Shimon dies. Well, Reuven pulled the trigger. Reuven decided to pull the trigger. Yeah, that he did. But the contracting of the muscles in his finger is God manipulating his body in accordance with his will. So is Reuven really responsible for killing Shimon? How do we understand the responsibility that we have for the actions that we do if we take seriously the idea that everything that happens in the natural world is due to divine causation, to divine providence? Here, this is not like other problems of free will. Here, the problem is only that if God is running the physical world, there doesn't seem room for my decisions to do anything. I think that's right. I think it's right. I think we can answer the question of responsibility anyway. Yes, when I decide to move my hand to give the coin, my decision to move my hand doesn't cause my body to move. And by the way, we experience this from time to time when we decide to do something and the body refuses. If, I'm not wishing this on you, but if you catch a cramp in a muscle, you can tell your leg to move, but it won't move. It just says, no, not going. So your will, or for example, you're falling asleep over some material you have to learn, and you think, I don't want to fall asleep. Zzz. Because you don't want to fall asleep, doesn't control the outcome of the body. Not every time when you decide does the body do what you want it to do. That indicates at least that there's something there that you're not in control of. So, how then can I be responsible? And the answer, I think, is this. I know from experience that almost always, when I decide that my body should do something, it does it. It means that the Creator has a principle of almost always causing my body to do what I decide. Almost always. The case of the cramp or the case of falling asleep shows it isn't always, but it's almost always. He has that policy. Why he has that policy, I'll discuss with you in a minute. My knowing that policy teaches me this. He's asking for charity. I know from experience that if I decide to give him charity, the body delivers the coin. And if I decide not to give him charity, the body doesn't deliver the coin. So I know that my decision will be the outcome, even though I'm not causing the outcome. I'm not creating the outcome. Well then, that's enough responsibility for me to be told, well then, decide to give the charity. Because he needs it. And your experience teaches you that when you decide, that's what happens. I don't have to cause it. It doesn't have to be in my pocket, under my control, not my muscles that are my muscles. It's just that when I decide it, that's what happens. So I think that the problem of responsibility is not a serious problem. Why would God have a policy of almost always making the body do what I decide for the body to do? Well, imagine what the world would be like if it weren't so. He's asking for charity. What should I will? That my hand go into my pocket, pull out a coin, and give it to him? What happened the last 16 times that I willed that? Well, once I went and watered the flowers, and once I dialed my phone to call my cousin, and once I fell asleep, and once the coin came out, and once I, decided to plant the petunias, and I don't know. I decide that, and lots of different things happen, and there's no systematic relationship between what I decide and what happens. Could I then be responsible for any decisions at all? How would I choose what to decide if I didn't know what the consequences would be? I don't choose my body motion. I choose consequences. I'm typing an email, right? I'm not choosing to move this finger, and this finger. I'm typing to send, I'm choosing to send a message. If moving the fingers wouldn't send a message, I wouldn't do that. So if there isn't a systematic relationship between what I choose and what happens, I can't be responsible for what I do. That's why the world has to be regular. It has to be predictable. Not 100% regular, not 100% predictable. Well, miracles sometimes happen when you don't expect them. But it has to be very regular, very predictable. Otherwise, I can't function as an agent. I can't be responsible for what I do. I can't make decisions to be held responsible for them. So, even though it's God's power that's making the world work, it has to look like, it has to feel like that it's my decision that's doing it, so that I can be responsible for what I do. So this is a little bit of how you work in the idea of divine providence running the world into our general scheme of ideas. There's one more such, yeah.
I was going to say, what if in the case of like the gun that you're pointing at someone and you get a cramp in your finger and your finger just spasms on its own and makes the gunfire even if you didn't want it to, then that's not, it seems like it's you pulling the trigger, but it's not you pulling the trigger?
Correct. The example that one of the great philosophers gave is this. Imagine two scenarios. One where a person's walking down the street and trips on something he didn't see and falls. And the second scenario where a very skilled actor is walking down the street and pretends to trip and fall. The first one is an accident, and the second one is an action. Precisely because the first one wasn't under his control, and the second one was under his control. The difference between an action and an accident often is just the inner reality. Is there a will there and control there, or isn't there will and control? So yes, indeed, if he's holding the gun loosely and his finger spasms, then he didn't pull the trigger. Just like, well, in English you can't say it so well, but the trigger was pulled by his finger, but he didn't do it. It wasn't an action of his. So I think that's exactly right.
Would that hold up in court?
I'm sorry?
I feel like it wouldn't hold up in court.
Oh, I think it would. Sure, if you could prove that that's what happened, I think it would. You know, certain periods in a soldier's life, he's got to walk around with his gun, with his finger on the trigger all the time. I'm told, he's got to sleep with it. That it's got to become part of him. Right? Now, let's say the gun's supposed to be unloaded, and he indeed keeps it unloaded, but somebody loaded it without his knowledge. And then, because his finger's on the trigger, it goes off. I think the court would say, it wasn't your fault. Look at this old, years-long thing with Alec Baldwin, killed somebody on the set. And was it the person who loaded it? Fault? I think that unless you decide to do it, there's going to be a substantial excuse that you're not responsible. Okay, now Rav Dessler has a very dramatic picture of how this works And it raises one more question, which I'll deal with, and then we'll be finished for today. I don't know if they teach you this or not. How does a video work? Well, there's a lot of images stored, and they are shown on the screen one after another. It could be 16 per second or 24 per second. And your eye and your brain don't register the stopping of one picture and the beginning of another picture. The replacement is too rapid. You perceive it as a smooth picture of motion. Really, each one is separate. And you know that because you can stop the video and you can just have that picture there. So now, Rav Dessler says, when we say that God recreates the world moment by moment, we say it in the morning in the davening, it's like those pictures. Each moment is a new creation. Now, there was something called subliminal advertising, which became illegal, where you'll be in the theater, and you're watching a motion picture, and some scene is going on, and in the middle there'd be like one picture which says, get a Coke. But that's 1/16th of a second. And the other 15/16ths are the scenario, so you don't consciously see it. Yeah, but your unconscious sees it, and then you get very thirsty, and then you go and get a Coke. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't work, maybe it's a joke. That was the idea, subliminal advertising. So what that shows you is this. Each picture is a totally independent picture. You don't say, well, you see, in this picture, the window broke because in the previous window, the stone was hitting the window. So if the stone's hitting the window has to break. No, it's a separate picture. The next picture could be, go get a Coke, with no stone at all. That's what editors do. Editors decide which pictures to put in and which ones to leave out, and what order they should go. They're totally separate pictures. Okay, if our world is a moving picture recreation, it means each moment is a separate moment, a separate creation. So, if a stone is released and then a second later it hits the ground, you can't say, well, you see, it was released and there's nothing supporting it, so it had to hit the ground. What do you mean it had to hit the ground? It's hitting the ground. It's a brand new creation. It wasn't there before. There's a creation where the stone's released, and there's a creation where it hits the ground. And just like the editor could put in, go get a Coke, God could have put in the stone floating or disappearing or anything else. Nothing causes anything else. Nothing makes anything happen. Nothing forces anything to happen. Nothing necessitates something happening. Those of you who study philosophy, you hear David Hume here, you hear right. So it comes out that, strictly speaking, there's no such thing as causation. That's going to take some thinking about. But here's a very simple application which puzzles some people. What then is the use of medicine? Isn't the function of medicine to discover what causes what disease and what kinds of things will cure the disease? What routines or what medicines can cure the disease? What medicines will cause the disease to be cured? Aren't we looking for causes and effects all the time? Avoid XYZ because XYZ carries disease? If we don't believe in causation, why does any of this make sense? And the answer, which is similar to the answer I gave before, is this. Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is committed to the appearance of causation. That's why things, at least when we're looking, fall into categories, and we have expectations of what's going to happen. The water was boiling at 9:02, and I put the cold raw egg in, so at 9:07 I can take it out, and it'll be hard, and indeed it'll be hard, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu has a commitment to the world being or appearing regular when we're looking, so that we can predict the outcomes of our actions, so that we can take responsibility for our actions. So indeed, there's no real causation. Nothing in the boiling water at 9:02 contributes to hard egg at 9:07. But because Baruch Hu wants me to see. Putting it at 902 results in a heartache at 907, so it's going to be hard at 907. Almost always it will work out that way, because Baruch Hu wants me to live in that kind of regular world. So it pays to study medicine, not because you're really discovering what causes what, but you're discovering what to do so that God will give you the outcome that you want, because He's committed to the regularity of the events that we perceive. And he finds an actual statement in the Talmud which supports this. Ein a bracha mitzuya el b'dover hasamui min ha'ayin, say Chazal. Bracha, which is a miraculous expansion of something's quantity, is found only in something that's hidden from the eye. And Chazal say, if you're a farmer and you're taking in your harvest and you're storing it in various storehouses and so on, don't measure it. Don't measure it until you have to. Because while you haven't yet measured it, you don't know how much it is. If you don't know how much it is, then you could be recipient of a blessing which will give it more quantity. But once you've counted it, then you would have to have an open miracle. And that's much, much less frequent, and that because Baruch Hu invests in something like that. So it means, what Rabbi understands this Chazal to mean, I think it's pretty obvious, that when you're not looking, there are no rules. When you're not looking, anything could happen, and maybe anything does happen. The idea of regularity is only so we should perceive it, so it contributes to our ability to make responsible decisions, and for other things as well. But it's only for the sake of our service, our spiritual development. That's why we observe it that way. But it has no purchase on the world when we're not looking. And that means it isn't real externally. That's not what's really going on. What's really going on is that God is making the world continuously, like we say every morning in the morning prayers. So this idea, which on the surface sounds quite radical and quite disorienting, can be relocated into the complex of how we live our lives, the mosaic of our picture of the world. That it can be done, but it takes some work. Did you have a question?
It sounds like quantum mechanics, the way you were describing with the brain.
Yes, there is a feature of quantum mechanics which answers to this, although everything about quantum mechanics is controversial. Everything. But there is the idea that there are certain qualities of things, particles, which they don't have until you measure. And what you choose to measure is then what becomes real. And the other, you could have chosen to measure something else, then this wouldn't have become real. But you chose to measure this, so it becomes real. This requires a measurement action. It's not something which you can do just by consciousness, which would be the collapse of the wave function, which I'm not talking about. But if you do a measurement, an unmeasured particle doesn't have a precise position. When you measure it, for that moment where it's measured, it does have a precise position. So, because you measured it, it acquired a precise position that it didn't have before. But it's not so surprising when you say that I measured it, so I interacted with it. I changed it. Well, sure, if I interact with something, it's not going to be the same later as it was before. But there is that fact that we bring this about. Sorry.
I mean, it's going on its own. The fact that you measured it is just for your personal understanding. It's going to happen on its own.
Actually, that's not correct. Actually, it's not correct. There are experimental results which don't tolerate that kind of understanding. I'll tell you just very, very briefly one of them, the double slit experiment. You have something which produces particles, fires them in all directions. You have a wall. The wall has two gaps in it, and then you have a screen that catches those things. Now, if you close up one gap and fire randomly, some will go through the gap, and they'll be caught on the other side of the gap. Close this one and open that one, and fire randomly. Some will go through the upper gap. They'll be caught on the other side of the gap. So you do it that way, each one, and you see, if this one's open, you get them in this area. If this one's open, you get them in this area. So now what's going to happen if they're both open? So some will go through this one and go over here, and some will go through this one and will go over there. You'll have this collection and this collection. That's not what happens at all. What happens is you get bands. There's a band of collection and a band empty, and a band of collection and band empty, and a band of collection and a band empty. You get bands. Not only that, but some of them end up in a place where none ended up when they had single gaps open. Some of them end up in places like that. So something else is going on here. And now this happens when you shoot the particles through one at a time. So it's one at a time. Your natural thought is, well, either it went through the upper one or it went through the lower one. Couldn't be in two places at once. So it got to be a bunch here and a bunch there, and that's all there is to it. But it isn't. It's bands. Bands are a sign of wave function. Waves at the seashore will do that if you manipulate them correctly. So it's understood as a kind of wave thing. But the wave pattern would only work if something went through both slits and then interfered afterwards. So if you're shining a light, which is trillions and trillions of particles all the time, that's okay, because you got lots of them, and then lots go through, and then they interfere with one another, and they produce a result. But if I have them one at a time, you're not going to get that. So the official story is, you fire it, it comes out of here. When it reaches the screen, it reaches over there, but in between, it's replaced by purple fuzz. Well, not really purple fuzz, but it's replaced by something else which goes through both slits. It's replaced by something that goes through both slits simultaneously, and the other side interferes the way waves do, and then when it gets to the screen, becomes a single dot again. So it isn't simply that we don't know. It's got to be that when we're not looking, it doesn't have a position. Because if it had a position, it would have to go through one slit or the other slit, and that's the whole story. And then you'd get a group here and a group here, and you wouldn't get the bands. So it simply can't be a matter of just what we don't know. That's one of the many, many examples of how, in quantum mechanics, these things don't have these qualities when you're not looking. Have a wonderful Shabbos. Join Shabbos Hanukkah, and I'll see you on Sunday, Mi'ez Hashem.